When I found that letter pinned to my door, I thought it was just another petty HOA notice. But what started with a warning about my lawn turned into a full-scale war one that would divide my neighborhood, draw national attention, and prove that sometimes the wildest rebellion can grow right in your own front yard. The letter on the door, it all began on an ordinary morning in a quiet, manicured suburb where every lawn was clipped to perfection, every hedge sculpted like it belonged in a glossy magazine, and every driveway pressure washed until the concrete nearly gleamed. The neighborhood prided itself on appearances, and for years, the Homeowners Association had been the silent enforcer of those unwritten laws of suburban conformity. For most people, life in this neighborhood was predictable. Wake up, mow the lawn on Saturday, wave politely to neighbors, and make sure the roses bloomed on cue. But for me, that morning shattered the illusion of normalcy in a way I never could have expected. As I opened my front door, coffee mug in hand, my eyes fell on a piece of paper pinned to the frame. It wasn't the usual community newsletter or coupon flyer. No, this was a notice official, stamped with the HOAS emblem, and written in a tone so cold and sharp it might as well have been carved from stone. The words declared that my lawn, my modest patch of green that had grown a little wild after a particularly rainy month, was in violation of community standards. The grass, they claimed, was excessively long, unkempt, and disruptive to neighborhood aesthetics. They demanded I mow it within 7 days or face daily fines that could climb into the hundreds. I stood there, reading and rereading the letter, feeling a strange mixture of disbelief and irritation. My lawn wasn't perfect, but it was hardly an eyesore. It wasn't filled with weeds or junk, just grass that had stretched taller than usual. It seemed absurd that something so trivial could spark such hostility. But that's how the whole worked. They thrived on control, on bending homeowners to their will under the guise of community standards. At first, I considered complying. It would have been easier to cut the grass, tidy up, and avoid trouble. But as I looked around, I noticed something. The neighbor 2 doors down had bare patches of dirt on his front yard. Across the street, another homeowner's lawn was littered with garden gnomes and faded ornaments that clashed violently with the neighborhood's beige uniformity. And yet, no notices fluttered on their doors. It wasn't about the grass. It was about me. I remembered the time I had declined to join one of the HOAS weekend volunteer projects, when members paraded around clipping bushes that didn't belong to them and leaving behind passive-aggressive notes for those who hadn't participated, or the time I had spoken up during a meeting about excessive fees being charged without transparency. Ever since then, I had felt the subtle but unmistakable weight of their scrutiny. This letter wasn't about community standards. It was about power. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Why should I bend to their will? Why should I trim my grass into submission just to feed their illusion of control? The longer I stared at the notice, the more it felt less like a warning and more like a challenge. That night, as I sat in my living room, the letter crumpled on the coffee table. An idea began to take shape. If they thought my lawn was unsightly now, what would they do if it became something far more outrageous? If they wanted to dictate what beauty should look like, what if I created a kind of beauty they couldn't possibly control? The thought lodged itself in my mind and refused to leave. I imagined vines creeping over the mailbox, flowers blooming in wild, impossible colors, and trees rising where none had been planted before. I pictured butterflies, bees, and birds turning my yard into a sanctuary, a riot of life that contrasted so starkly with the sterile saneness of the rest of the neighborhood. The HOA wanted a fight, and they didn't even realize they had just handed me the perfect excuse. The next morning, instead of dragging out the mower, I drove to a local nursery. Rows upon rows of plants greeted me: ferns, shrubs, climbing vines, towering bamboo stalks, and flowers in every shade imaginable. I felt like a general preparing for war, selecting my army with care. I loaded my car with greenery until there was barely space left for me to sit. Neighbors watched curiously as I carried tray after tray of plants into my yard. Some whispered, some frowned, and others shook their heads knowingly, already envisioning the next HOA meeting filled with complaints. But I ignored them. For the first time in months, I felt alive, energized by the rebellion taking root in my mind. That week, while others dutifully clipped their grass to regulation height. I dug, planted, watered, and dreamed. My yard slowly transformed, shifting from a slightly overgrown patch into something untamed, unpredictable, and undeniably bold. But with every shovel of dirt, I knew I was drawing the HOA's attention, and deep down, I was counting on it. Because if they thought a notice was enough to scare me into obedience, they were about to learn that this was no longer about grass. It was about freedom. It was about showing them that beauty didn't have to fit inside their rigid little box. By the end of that week, my lawn was no longer just a lawn. It was the beginning of something bigger, a statement, a rebellion, a jungle in the making. And the letter that had started it all now sat buried at the bottom of my trash can, forgotten by me, but about to become the spark of a battle that would consume the entire neighborhood. The war with the HOA had begun. The jungle takes root by the time the first week had passed. My yard no longer resembled the tidy, predictable lawns that surrounded it. What had once been a patch of grass trimmed into submission was now a chaotic orchestra of life. Ferns spread low across the ground, weaving carpets of green that defied the monotony of turf. Bright flowers burst into bloom in shades of orange, red, and violet, throwing color against the dull beige of the neighborhood. Bamboo stalks rose like sentinels at the edges, their leaves whispering secrets in the breeze. And in the corner, a climbing vine began to snake up my mailbox, draping it in leafy rebellion. Each day brought new activity. Bees drifted lazily from bloom to bloom. Birds perched on the bamboo, filling the morning air with songs far more genuine than the hum of lawnmowers. Butterflies appeared as if summoned by some unseen signal, hovering above the jungle in progress. Where my neighbors' yards were silent, mine was alive. And while I reveled in it, the rest of the neighborhood simmered. At first, there were whispers. A couple walking their dogs slowed down to stare, their conversation pausing as their eyes darted from my yard to each other. A group of children pointed and giggled, their laughter mixing curiosity with mischief. But soon, whispers became mutters, and mutters hardened into complaints. It wasn't long before the HOA noticed, on the second Saturday morning, as I watered the bamboo and watched droplets scatter like diamonds in the sunlight, I spotted them to board members walking slowly down the street, clipboards in hand. Their expressions carried the weight of authority, as though they were generals surveying enemy territory. They stopped at the edge of my property, scribbled furiously on their forms, and shook their heads with synchronized disapproval. Later that day, another letter appeared. This one wasn't just a warning, it was a demand. They declared my lawn in gross violation of community codes and accused me of creating an environmental hazard. The irony made me laugh. In a neighborhood sterilized into lifeless uniformity, they called a garden of life hazardous. But beneath their hollow words was a clear threat: escalating fines, legal action, even the possibility of liens placed against my home if I refused to comply. I read it carefully, every sentence dripping with arrogance, and then I set it aside. I had already decided. I would not be moved. The jungle had become more than a project. It was a statement of independence, a living banner of defiance waving in the heart of suburbia. The more they pushed back, the more determined I became. And so I doubled down. I returned to the nursery and filled my car again, this time with creeping ivy, towering sunflowers, and tropical plants better suited for rainforests than cul-de-sacs. I installed a small pond lined with stones, its surface rippling as dragonflies hovered above. The yard grew denser, wilder, richer with every passing day. Neighbors' reactions sharpened. Some stood at their windows, blinds half drawn, staring as though my yard were a crime scene. Others muttered loudly as they passed by, their words sharp enough to carry, but never direct enough to confront me. But not everyone disapproved. One evening, an elderly man from the end of the street walked by, paused, and let a faint smile cross his face. For a moment, I realized not everyone was against me. Some saw the beauty in rebellion or still. The HOA could not let this stand. At the next community meeting, I became the main topic. They called my lawn a disgrace, an eyesore, and even a danger to property values. Neighbors who had once waved politely now pointed fingers, demanding action. But beneath their outrage was something else: fear. My jungle had broken the illusion of control. If one homeowner could defy the rules so boldly, others might follow. and that was a risk the HOA could not afford. Within days, they escalated. I began receiving daily letters, each one more severe than the last. Photographs of my yard were included as evidence. They claimed the bamboo posed a threat, the pond attracted pests, and the flowers clashed with the neighborhood's harmonious aesthetic. Every sentence carried the same demand: remove it all or face consequences. But every letter only fueled me further. I framed one on my wall, not as a warning, but as a trophy. If they thought intimidation would work, they didn't know me at all. By the end of the second month, my yard was no longer just a jungle, it was a spectacle. Strangers passing through the neighborhood slowed their cars to look. Some even stopped to take photos, their cameras capturing the wild contrast between my untamed paradise and the sterile lawns that surrounded it. My rebellion had become a landmark, and as it grew, so did the storm around it. The HOA was no longer content with letters. They began sending inspectors, patrolling my street as though it were under siege. I could feel the tension rising, coiling like a spring ready to snap. I knew something bigger was coming, something more than words, fines, or empty threats. They weren't going to stop, and neither was I. The jungle had taken root. The battle lines were drawn, and the real war was about to begin. Escalation. The third month. The jungle was no longer a quiet rebellion, it had become the neighborhood's obsession. What started as a patch of unruly grass had transformed into a thriving ecosystem, lush and untamed, standing defiantly against the manicured monotony that surrounded it. And though I saw beauty every time I stepped outside, the HOA saw nothing but a challenge to their authority. The letters had grown relentless. Each envelope carried not just warnings, but carefully crafted threats. They spoke of fines that compounded daily, of liens that could be attached to my property, and of legal action that could end in foreclosure if I continued to neglect my obligations. As a homeowner, the language was cold, bureaucratic, and ruthless. It was no longer about grass, it was about breaking me. I knew their tactics well. The HOA thrived on fear. They counted on homeowners folding under pressure, paying fines, trimming hedges, repainting shutters, anything to restore the illusion of order. But with me, they had found someone unwilling to bend, and that made me dangerous in their eyes. The first confrontation happened on a Sunday afternoon. I was kneeling by the pond, adjusting a few stones, when I noticed a small crowd gathering near the sidewalk. At the center stood the HOA president, a woman whose reputation for pettiness had earned her a nickname whispered behind closed doors, the Queen of Beige. She thrived on conformity, her own yard a sterile masterpiece of trimmed hedges and colorless mulch. She didn't knock or call my name. She simply stood at the edge of my property, arms crossed, her voice raised loud enough for every neighbor to hear. She spoke of violations, of shame, of the disgrace I had brought upon the community. She pointed to the bamboo, to the vines curling over the mailbox, to the riot of flowers that clashed so violently with her palette of beige. She declared my yard a blight, a hazard, and an insult to every family who followed the rules. Neighbors nodded, muttered in agreement, some even clapped, but others remained silent, their eyes drifting over the jungle with a hint of wonder. I said nothing. I didn't need to. My silence was louder than any defense I could have spoken. The HOA president left with a final promise that legal action was already underway, and within a week, she proved it. A thick envelope arrived, heavier than the usual notices. Inside were official papers, drafted by attorneys, declaring the HOA's intent to sue if I did not comply. They cited bylaws, codes, and legal precedents, all carefully arranged to paint me as the villain. It was intimidation dressed in legalese, but beneath the jargon was a clear message: give up, or we will crush you. Instead of fear, I felt resolve harden within me. They had declared war, and I was ready to fight. I began documenting everything. Photos of the yard at different times of day, showing its beauty and life. Videos of bees pollinating flowers, of butterflies dancing on the breeze, of birds nesting in the bamboo. I saved every letter, every threat, every scrap of evidence that revealed the HOA's obsession. I knew that in a battle this big, documentation was a weapon. And then something unexpected happened. One afternoon, a car slowed in front of my house. The driver, a young man with a camera slung around his neck, stepped out and began snapping photos. When I asked what he was doing, he explained he was a blogger who covered unusual gardens and landscapes. Word of my suburban jungle had spread beyond the neighborhood, and people were beginning to take notice. Within days, a small article appeared online, "The Man Who Turned His Lawn into a Jungle to Defy His HOA." It wasn't sensational, just a quirky human interest piece, but it lit a spark. Comments flooded in, some mocking, others admiring, but most cheering the act of rebellion against what many saw as the tyranny of HOAs. Soon, strangers began driving through the neighborhood, slowing down to catch a glimpse of the jungle. Some even parked and walked by, taking photos, pointing in awe at the wild explosion of green in the middle of sterile suburbia. My yard had become a destination. The HOA, of course, was livid. Their letters grew more frantic, their meetings more heated. They accused me of humiliating the community, of dragging its reputation into the mud. But the truth was undeniable. The more they fought me, the more attention I gained. And the more attention I gained, the more support I found. What had started as a personal act of defiance was becoming something bigger, a symbol of resistance against petty rules and oppressive control. My jungle was no longer just mine. It belonged to everyone who had ever felt bullied by an HOA, silenced by conformity, or punished for daring to be different. But the HOA wasn't about to give up. If anything, they grew more determined. Behind closed doors, they plotted their next move, one that would push the conflict beyond notices and threats. They wanted to make an example of me, to prove that no homeowner could defy them and win. And as I tended to my yard one evening, watching fireflies blink in the growing dusk, I could feel it coming. The calm before the storm. The escalation I knew was inevitable. The jungle had drawn the world's eyes, and now the HOA was preparing to strike harder than ever. The counterattack jungle had grown too loud to be ignored. What began as a local act of defiance had blossomed into something larger, drawing the attention of strangers, journalists, and even online communities who saw in my story a reflection of their own struggles against oppressive HOA letters. My yard had become a symbol, but symbols have a way of stirring fear in those who cling to power. And the HOA was terrified. The first wave of their counterattack came not in whispers or notices, but in a lawsuit. Thick, heavy papers were delivered to my door by a process server, stamped with the insignia of the county court. The HOA accused me of violating over a dozen bylaws: improper landscaping, environmental hazards, obstruction of community aesthetics, and even claims of diminished property values. Their goal was clear: not just to fine me, but to crush me legally, financially, and emotionally. That I knew they expected me to panic. Most homeowners would have. The threat of mounting legal fees, court appearances, and possible foreclosure was enough to break anyone's resolve. But instead of retreating, I prepared. Every photograph, every video, every piece of correspondence I had saved became ammunition. The jungle was no longer just a garden, it was evidence of beauty, of life, of a community enriched rather than harmed. But the HOA didn't stop at legal action. They escalated in ways that felt almost personal. Board members began driving past my house slowly, their eyes fixed on the yard, clipboards clutched tightly like weapons. Anonymous complaints were filed with the city, false claims about pest infestations, unsafe water in the pond, even wild accusations that snakes were overrunning the street because of me. Inspectors came and went, each time leaving empty-handed, but the harassment was constant, gnawing at the edges of peace. Then came the intimidation. My mailbox was vandalized, its hinges bent as though pried open with force. Tire tracks appeared across the edge of my lawn, flattening flowers in the night. Neighbors I had once spoken to politely now crossed the street to avoid me, muttering words like troublemaker under their breath. The HOA had turned the community against me, painting me as the villain who endangered property values and harmony. But what they didn't anticipate was that the outside world was watching. The article that had first mentioned my jungle was picked up by a larger outlet, then another, until suddenly my story was everywhere. Headlines appeared: "Homeowner fights HOA with a jungle," "The suburban garden that sparked a war." When grass becomes rebellion. My inbox flooded with messages from strangers, people thanking me for standing up to their own nightmares with HOA letters, people sharing stories of petty fines, overreaching rules, and bullying boards. I wasn't alone anymore. The attention only fueled the HOA's rage. At their next meeting, they gathered a crowd larger than ever before. Voices rose, accusations flew, and the president, the self-proclaimed guardian of community order, declared publicly that I was destroying the neighborhood's reputation. But as she spoke, something surprising happened. Not everyone agreed. A handful of homeowners stood up, timid at first, but growing bolder. They spoke of how lifeless the neighborhood had been, how uniformity had sucked away creativity, how maybe, just maybe, my jungle was a reminder that beauty didn't have to be beige. The cracks had begun to show, or still, the HOA doubled down. They fast-tracked the lawsuit, pushing for an injunction that would force me to remove the jungle immediately. Even before the case went to trial, they thought urgency would overwhelm me. But I had allies, now neighbors, who quietly offered support, strangers who shared advice, and even a lawyer who reached out after reading my story online, offering representation at a fraction of the cost. For the first time, the battlefield felt even, and as the jungle grew taller, denser, and more untamed, it reflected the conflict itself. Vines twisted higher up the mailbox, sunflowers towered defiantly, and the pond shimmered under the weight of dragonflies. The more they tried to suppress it, the more vibrantly it thrived. My yard had become a mirror of resistance, an unstoppable force growing stronger under pressure. But wars are never without sacrifice. The tension in the neighborhood reached a boiling point. One night, I awoke to the sound of shouting outside. A group of teenagers, likely egged on by disgruntled parents, had tossed garbage across my lawn. Soda cans, wrappers, even broken glass littered the garden. As I cleaned up the mess under the pale morning light, I realized just how far the HOA was willing to go, using fear, social pressure, and even chaos to force me into submission. Yet instead of breaking me, it only hardened my resolve. They had escalated, and I would escalate too. No longer content with simply defending my lawn, I began to prepare for offense. If they wanted a fight, I would bring it to them, not just with plants, but with every tool at my disposal. And so, while the HOA plotted its legal maneuvers, I began plotting something of my own, a way to turn their obsession, their pettiness, their hunger for control against them, a way to make the jungle not just a rebellion, but a victory. The war was no longer just about my yard. It was about exposing the HOA for what it truly was and ensuring they could never silence me again. The breaking point lawsuit became the beating heart of the battle. Court dates were set, motions filed, and papers exchanged. The HOA's attorneys painted me as reckless, irresponsible, and dangerous to the community's reputation. They paraded photographs of my yard as if they were evidence of a crime scene, circling bamboo stalks and sunflowers as though they were weapons. But I had my defense. My lawyer, a calm but sharp-witted man who had seen HOA letters abuse power before, built a case not around defiance, but around rights. He gathered studies on pollinator gardens, ecological benefits, and the mental health value of green spaces. He pointed out inconsistencies in the HOA's enforcement, highlighting neighbors with neglected yards, cracked driveways, or gaudy ornaments who had never been fined. And most importantly, he framed the jungle as an expression of individuality in a community obsessed with control. The trial loomed, but the battle wasn't confined to the courtroom. The neighborhood itself had fractured. On one side were the loyalists, those who clung to the HOA's vision of uniform perfection. They whispered of property values, of outsiders gawking at our street, of the shame of becoming that neighborhood in the news. On the other side were the sympathizers' neighbors, who had grown weary of constant nitpicking, fines, and fear. They saw in my jungle a spark of freedom, a chance to question whether conformity was truly worth the cost. It showed in subtle ways. Some homeowners began letting their grass grow just a little longer, their hedges a little looser. A few planted wildflowers near their mailboxes, splashes of color against the monotony of beige. Others whispered encouragement when no one else was listening. The HOA had tried to isolate me, but instead they had inspired resistance. Or still, the board pressed on with fury. They organized emergency meetings, sent newsletters warning of the dangers of unchecked lawns, and even attempted to sway the local news into portraying me as a nuisance. But the media wasn't fooled. Reporters who visited my yard saw beauty, not blight. Articles spread, interviews aired, and the story reached further than I could have imagined. Online, the jungle became a symbol, memes, hashtags, and videos celebrated the stand against HOA tyranny. The pressure mounted with every passing day. I could feel the eyes of the nation watching, waiting to see who would bend first. The HOA, desperate to regain control, launched their most aggressive tactic yet. They petitioned the court for an emergency injunction to have my yard forcibly cleared, claiming imminent harm to the community. If granted, the jungle would be destroyed before the trial even began. The hearing for the injunction drew a crowd larger than anyone expected. Neighbors filled the benches, reporters lined the walls, and the HOA board sat stiff and confident in the front row. They spoke of chaos, of lowered property values, of supposed pests that no inspector had ever found. Their words dripped with exaggeration, but they delivered them with the certainty of those who believed control was their birthright. Then it was our turn. My lawyer presented photos and videos of bees pollinating flowers, of birds nesting peacefully, of children laughing as they pointed at butterflies floating through the air. He argued that the jungle was not harm but habitat, not chaos but creation. He pointed out that no bylaw explicitly banned the plants I had chosen, and that selective enforcement revealed the HOA's vendetta. When the judge leaned back in his chair, the courtroom held its breath, and then, with a voice steady and final, he denied the injunction. The jungle would remain at least until the trial concluded. The HOA president's face hardened like stone, her fury barely contained. But the moment she walked out of that courtroom, I knew something had shifted. The jungle had survived its first real test, and the board's power no longer seemed untouchable. Back in the neighborhood, the ripple effect grew stronger. More wildflowers appeared in front yards. More neighbors whispered about questioning the HOA's authority. What had started as one rebellion was spreading into quiet acts of defiance across the block. But I also knew the battle wasn't over. The trial still loomed, and the HOA was more desperate than ever. They would not accept defeat quietly. They would double down, push harder, and try every trick in the book to force me into submission. As I stood on my porch that evening, watching the sun dip behind the bamboo, I could feel that the war was reaching its climax. The HOA had thrown everything they had at me, but the jungle stood strong, a wall of green defiance. And now, the question wasn't just whether I could survive the fight. It was whether the HOA itself could survive the truth that was about to be exposed. The breaking point was near,